Welcome to When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, where I look at the films that shaped the tender young brains of those of us who were born between 1965 and 1980. By 1985, Martin Scorsese was already known as a world-class director on the strengths of such films as Mean Streets, Raging Bull, and Taxi Driver. His career hit a small bump in 1982 when the king of comedy met with a lukewarm reception. After his big-budget production of The Last Temptation of Christ was canceled by Paramount, Scorsese nursed his wounds by making a small-scale, independently financed comedy instead. After Hours. After Hours was written by Joseph Minion. After Hours generally isn't counted among Scorsese's absolute top tier of films, with Goodfellas and Raging Bull and Taxi Driver, but nonetheless, this is a film that has received a great deal of goodwill from critics and audiences. We open in Manhattan, in a very beige office, where a data entry worker named Paul shows his coworker Lloyd how to input data into the computer. Lloyd is played by Perfect Strangers star Bronson Pinchot, whom we have seen in Risky Business and Beverly Hills Cop. Paul is played by Griffin Dunne, whose other big film in the 80s was An American Werewolf in London. The son of journalist Dominic Dunne and brother of murdered Poltergeist actress Dominique Dunne, Griffin Dunne is known as both an actor and a director. Among other films, he directed 1998's fantasy comedy Practical Magic. After work, Paul returns to his beige apartment and watches some television, then heads out to a coffee shop. He's approached by a beautiful young woman named Marcy, who joins him at his table to discuss Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. Marcy is played by Rosanna Arquette, whom we have seen in Desperately Seeking Susan. Marcy is living in a loft in Soho with a sculptor friend who is known for making papier-mâché paperweights shaped like bagels and cream cheese. She gives Paul her number. Bored with his safe and uneventful life, Paul calls Marcy as soon as he gets home. Even though it's almost midnight, she invites him over. Paul catches a cab from his Upper East Side apartment to Soho. The cabbie drives recklessly, and Paul's $20 bill, which is the only money he has on him, flies out the window, forcing Paul to stiff the cabbie on the fare. In the enormous loft, he meets the sculptor, Kiki, who is shaping papier-mâché sculptures while wearing a lacy bra and a skirt. Kiki is played by Linda Fiorentino, whom we have seen in Vision Quest. While waiting for Marcy to return from the drugstore, Paul helps Kiki mold a sculpture of a man who appears to be in great agony. Paul flirts with Kiki, and Kiki drops ominous hints that Marcy is covered from head to toe in ugly scars. Marcy returns, filled with nervous energy. While she showers, Paul snoops around her possessions and finds prescription burn cream. Marcy and Paul go out for coffee at a nearby diner. Marcy tells Paul that her estranged husband is a Wizard of Oz obsessive, and whenever they had sex, he would scream out, "Surrender, Dorothy," upon ejaculation. The cashier tells them their coffee is on the house because different rules apply when it's after hours. The cashier is played by character actor Dick Miller, whom we have seen in Gremlins, The Terminator, and Chopping Mall. Paul and Marcy return to the loft, where Marcy, who is prone to strange behavior and sudden mood swings, abruptly breaks down into sobs. In Marcy's room, Paul finds books on rehabilitation from serious burns. Grossed out, Paul deliberately picks a fight with Marcy and storms out into the rainy night. He heads to the subway, but a fare increase took effect at midnight, and he doesn't have enough change to buy a token. He pops into a dive bar to get out of the rain, and a beehive-sporting waitress named Julie flirts with him. Julie is played by Teri Garr, famous at the time for her comedic turns in films like Young Frankenstein and Tootsie. Paul chats with a friendly bartender, Tom, who tells him about a string of burglaries in the neighborhood. Tom, who is played by John Hurd, known for films like Cat People and Home Alone, offers to loan Paul subway fare, but his cash register is locked. Tom gives Paul his apartment key and asks him to fetch the register key in exchange for subway fare. To show his good faith, Paul leaves his own apartment key with Tom. At Tom's apartment, Paul is confronted by suspicious tenants who think he might be the burglar menacing the neighborhood. On his way out, he runs into the actual burglars who are in the process of moving Kiki's statue of the agonized man into the back of their van. The burglars, Neil and Pepe, are played by Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong, known as the counterculture comedy duo Cheech and Chong, made famous by their 1978 film Up in Smoke. Paul chases them off. He enters the loft to return the sculpture and finds Kiki bound and gagged. Kiki assures him this wasn't the work of Neil and Pepe. Her boyfriend Horst tied her up. Horst is played by Will Patton, whom we have seen in Desperately Seeking Susan. Paul goes into Marcy's bedroom to apologize for his abrupt exit and finds her dead, having overdosed on Secanol. Kiki and Horst have already left to go clubbing, so Paul notifies the police about Marcy's death. While examining Marcy's corpse, he sees that she has no burns or scars, though she does have a tattoo of a top hat-wearing skull identical to one on Tom's keychain. Paul returns to the bar, but Tom has temporarily closed up to go out looking for Paul. Julie takes Paul up to her apartment across the street to get out of the rain. Julie Julie dances around to the Monkees' Last Train to Clarksville and Joni Mitchell's Chelsea Morning before sketching a picture of Paul. Much like Marcy, Julie has abrupt mood swings, vacillating between tears and giddy joy, and Paul flees her apartment as soon as he spots Tom returning. While a pair of good-natured leather daddies make out at the bar, Paul returns Tom's key to him. Before Paul can get his own key back, Tom fields a phone call notifying him of Marcy's death. It turns out Tom was Marcy's boyfriend. Tom breaks down in tears, so Paul returns to Julie's apartment. They make out a bit, she tries to give him one of Kiki's bagel and cream cheese paperweights, and Paul flees again. Tom has closed the bar again, so Paul heads to Tom's apartment to get his key and finds that the building has just been burglarized. The tenants once again suspect Paul is the culprit. Paul goes to a punk club called Club Berlin to find Kiki and Horst. The bouncer, played by Clarence Feldman, refuses to let him in unless he gets a mohawk. Inside the club, patrons try to forcibly shave Paul's head, and Paul has to fight his way out. Martin Scorsese has a quick cameo as a guy in the club operating a spotlight. Having nowhere else to go, Paul returns to Kiki's loft to steal a $20 bill incorporated into the papier-mâché of her sculpture. On the street outside, local residents sweep the neighborhood searching for the burglar. Paul gives the 20 to a taxi driver, who turns out to be the cabbie he'd stiffed before. The cabbie steals the 20 and speeds off. Paul meets a sympathetic woman named Gail, who takes him back to her apartment so he can use the phone to call a friend to pick him up. Gail is played by Schitt's Creek star Catherine O'Hara, whom we have seen in Beetlejuice. Gail, who drives a Mr. Softy ice cream truck, turns out to be every bit as unhinged as every other character Paul has met over the course of his strange evening. She plays pranks on him to prevent him from dialing the phone. When Paul snaps at her, she apologizes and offers to give him a ride home in the Mr. Softy truck. On the way to the truck, though, she spots a flyer that a jilted and angry Julie has distributed around the neighborhood, using her sketch of Paul to accuse him of being the burglar. Gail summons a vigilante mob who chase Paul through the streets. He hides in an alley where he happens to witness a random violent homicide taking place in a nearby apartment. Paul throws himself on the mercy of a stranger, a soft-spoken man played by Robert Plunkett, who assumes Paul is looking for a hookup. He takes Paul back to his apartment, where Paul tells him a long, anxious, rambling account of everything that happened that night. Paul spots Julie posting flyers outside and rushes out to confront her. Instead, he's chased by the vigilante mob. He ducks into a diner to hide and spots a grief-stricken Tom sitting by himself. While Tom heads back to his bar to get Paul's key, a punk girl gives Paul an invitation to a private art reception taking place at Club Berlin. As the vigilante mob surrounds the diner, Paul races to Club Berlin. It's now completely empty, apart from a bartender played by Stephen Lim, and a lonely sculptor named June, played by Verna Bloom, known for films like High Plains Drifter and Animal House. While Peggy Lee's Is That All There Is plays on the jukebox, Paul and June dance. June takes Paul to her apartment in the club basement. The vigilante mob swarm the club, so June wraps Paul in burlap and plaster to turn him into a sculpture eerily reminiscent of the one in Kiki's loft. Later that night, Pepe and Neil break into June's apartment and steal the sculpture, stashing it in the back of their van. As day breaks, Pepe and Neil drive uptown. The back door of the van opens, the sculpture falls out, the plaster shatters, and Paul is freed. He finds himself at the front entrance of his office building as the doors open for the start of a new day of work. Paul sits down in front of his computer and gets ready for another day of data entry. Early on, the coffee shop cashier played by Dick Miller sums up the film's theme when he tells Paul and Marcy that the rules are different after hours. Paul thought he was prepared for the evening. He had a $20 bill plus exact change for the subway. But the rules changed as soon as he moved from uptown in the daylight to downtown at night, and Paul is wildly unprepared for everything that gets thrown at him. Throughout the film, no character Paul encounters behaves in a predictable way. Paul is never able to get control of any situation during his long and disturbing night. To be fair, Paul often exacerbates his own problems and makes the situation worse for himself, but as played by Griffin Dunne, he comes across as endearing rather than exasperating. And Dunne is surrounded by terrific actors with great comic timing, like Teri Garr and Catherine O'Hara and Cheech and Chong. This is a funny film, though the humor comes from some pretty dark places. Marcy's death by suicide isn't played for laughs exactly, but at the same time we're not expected to view it with the gravitas that such an event would require in real life. Marcy's death, like everything else that happens in the film, is mostly intended as evidence that Paul is in over his head because he can't make sense of the new rules that govern everything at night. Based on prolific evidence, Paul believes Marcy is covered in horrific burns, but in fact she's unblemished. Paul assumes Neil and Pepe, who are in fact prolific burglars, stole Kiki's statue, but it turns out they legitimately bought it from her. Gail seems friendly and helpful, but she's actually the ruthless head of a vigilante mob. Every conclusion Paul draws seems grounded in logic, but turns out to be wildly inaccurate. that. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that there's a school of thought that believes After Hours is a prolonged castration metaphor, in the way Paul spends the film being thrown off balance by various strange and dominating women, and sure, I think you can find evidence to support that theory. I'm so close to reaching the end of this series, and After Hours makes an excellent bookend to the very first film I looked at here, Desperately Seeking Susan. Both films came out in 1985, both star Rosanna Arquette, and both center around the madcap adventures of a fish out of water in a wild and lawless New York City, filled with cool Soho lofts, punk clubs, murder, and lots of unpredictable behavior. In Desperately Seeking Susan, the events of the film are life-changing for Rosanna Arquette's Roberta, who never returns to her safe suburban life after her exposure to the chaotic allure of the city. In After Hours, though, nothing about Paul's life changes. As the end credits roll, he finds himself deposited back to the same spot he was in during the opening credits. We're left with the impression that very soon the walls of his dull beige life will close back around him. He'll only have faded memories of the tornado of chaos that swept him up that one time he ventured out into the city after hours. Scorsese is pretty highbrow and respectable, so next time I'm going to have to balance things out by looking at some ridiculous trash. I'll be examining a 1984 B-movie classic that kind of has to be seen to be believed, Voyage of the Rock Aliens, starring Craig Sheffer and Pia Zadora. Thank you for joining me here today, and I will meet you here for that.